A lavish wedding unfolded beneath the warm morning sun in the quiet town of Ashbrook, where generations of families had celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, and marriages inside the historic stone chapel standing proudly at the edge of the town square. Fresh white roses lined the pathway leading to the entrance, while elegant ribbons fluttered gently in the breeze. Guests arrived dressed in their finest clothes, smiling as they exchanged greetings and admired the decorations. Soft music floated through the air, blending perfectly with the peaceful atmosphere that made the day feel almost magical. For Ethan Carter, the day represented the ending of one chapter and the beginning of another. At 29 years old, he believed he had finally found the person he wanted beside him forever. His friends often described him as patient, dependable, and endlessly optimistic, someone who believed every problem could be solved through kindness and understanding. Those qualities had drawn people toward him his entire life, especially Sophia Bennett. As Ethan adjusted the cuffs of his dark navy suit inside the chapel's preparation room, he looked into the mirror with a nervous smile. His best man, Daniel Brooks, noticed the mixture of excitement and anxiety on his face. "You've checked your tie at least 10 times, Daniel joked with a grin. "I just want everything to be perfect." "It already is." Ethan laughed quietly before shaking his head. "I still can't believe today's finally here." Daniel patted his shoulder. "You've waited long enough." Outside, guests continued filling the wooden pews, while whispers of admiration spread throughout the chapel. "The flowers are beautiful. They make such a wonderful couple. I'd never seen Ethan this happy." The comments reflected what nearly everyone believed. Ethan and Sophia seemed destined for one another. They had met 2 years earlier during a volunteer fundraiser organized after severe flooding affected neighboring communities. While helping distribute food and supplies, they discovered an immediate connection built upon compassion and shared values. Their relationship moved steadily afterward, surprising friends with how naturally their lives blended together. Sophia quickly became known as someone who preferred quiet evenings over crowded parties. She rarely spoke about her childhood or extended family, explaining only that she had left painful memories behind years ago. Ethan respected her privacy without asking unnecessary questions. To him, everyone deserved the chance to leave difficult chapters behind. Sophia stood inside the bridal suite, while her maid of honor carefully adjusted the delicate veil resting over her dark hair. The ivory wedding gown fit perfectly, flowing gracefully toward the polished wooden floor. Anyone entering the room would have seen a confident bride moments away from marrying the man she loved. Only those paying close attention might have noticed her trembling hands. "You okay?" her maid of honor asked softly. Sophia forced a gentle smile. "Just nervous. Every bride gets nervous." "I know. You'll feel better once you see Ethan." "I hope so." She looked toward the window overlooking the garden surrounding the chapel. For a brief second, her smile disappeared completely. Her breathing became slightly uneven before she slowly closed her eyes, collecting herself. "You really love him, don't you?" her friend asked. "More than anything." "Then today is exactly where you're supposed to be." Sophia nodded, though something deep inside refused to settle. Across the property, Richard Carter watched guests arrive, while keeping politely distant from the conversation surrounding him. At 58 years old, he carried himself with quiet confidence earned through decades of hard work running the family's construction business. Friends respected his discipline, while employees admired his fairness. Yet beneath his composed appearance rested growing concern that he had shared with almost no one. He believed Ethan was rushing into marriage. 2 years felt too short. Richard had voiced his worries months earlier, though never aggressively. He simply believed important decisions deserved patience. Ethan always listened respectfully before gently disagreeing. "When you know," Ethan had told him. Richard never argued further. He wanted his son to be happy. Still, something about Sophia remained difficult for him to understand. She was always polite, always respectful, and never gave him any reason to dislike her. Yet she remained strangely guarded whenever conversations drifted toward her past. Questions about childhood friends, old photographs, or family traditions were usually answered with brief smiles before she changed the subject. Richard told himself everyone carried painful memories. Perhaps that was all. Even so, the feeling never completely disappeared. The church bells rang softly as guests stood to their feet. Music filled the chapel. The large wooden doors slowly opened. Sophia appeared beside her escort, breathtaking beneath the afternoon sunlight pouring through stained glass windows. Gasps echoed across the room as everyone turned to admire her. Ethan's eyes immediately filled with emotion. There she was. The woman he believed had changed his life forever. Sophia met his gaze from the opposite end of the aisle. For just one beautiful moment, every fear seemed to vanish. She smiled. He smiled back. The ceremony began peacefully. The officiant welcomed family and friends before speaking about trust, commitment, and unconditional love. Ethan listened carefully, unable to stop looking at Sophia. Every glance convinced him he had made the right decision. Sophia tried to remain focused, but every few moments, her eyes drifted toward the chapel entrance. Only briefly. Almost instinctively. Each time she looked, her shoulders stiffened ever so slightly before she forced herself to return her attention to the ceremony. Richard noticed. It was subtle. So subtle that no one else seemed aware of it. He quietly wondered whether she was simply overwhelmed by emotion. Then it happened again. Sophia looked toward the entrance. Not once. Not twice. Several times. Richard followed her line of sight. At first, he saw nothing unusual beyond late-arriving guests slipping quietly inside. Then, through the open doorway, beyond the rows of parked cars and flowering trees, he spotted a lone man standing across the street. The stranger wore a dark coat despite the warm weather. He made no effort to join the guests. He simply stood motionless, watching the ceremony from a distance. His expression revealed nothing. When his eyes briefly met Richard's, neither man looked away. A strange chill crept through Richard's body, though he could not explain why. Something about the man's silent presence felt completely out of place. Richard glanced back toward Sophia. Her face had gone noticeably pale. For the first time that entire morning, he saw genuine fear in her eyes. And without realizing it, Richard took one slow step toward the chapel doors, unaware that the quiet observer outside was about to pull him into a nightmare that would destroy every life connected to the wedding. Richard could not shake the feeling that settled over him after seeing the stranger standing beyond the chapel grounds. The wedding ceremony continued, laughter returned during the reception, and guests celebrated late into the evening, but the image of that silent observer lingered in his thoughts. Every time Richard glanced toward the windows, he wondered whether the man was still somewhere nearby, watching from the shadows with unsettling patience. As the festivities gradually shifted into the rehearsal dinner for close family members and friends, the atmosphere became warm and relaxed. Candles flickered across long wooden tables inside an elegant reception hall, while conversations blended with soft music. Ethan laughed freely beside Sophia, completely unaware that his father barely touched his meal. "You seem distracted," Ethan said quietly. "Just tired," Richard answered. "You've hardly eaten." "I'll be fine." Sophia looked toward Richard with a polite smile. "I hope everything is all right." "It is." His response came quickly, almost automatically. Yet his attention kept drifting toward the entrance. Hours passed before Richard finally excused himself from the gathering. Cool night air greeted him as he stepped outside, hoping the silence would calm his restless thoughts. The parking lot was nearly empty except for a handful of vehicles belonging to relatives helping with last-minute wedding preparations. Then he saw him. The same man stood beneath a street lamp across the road. He wasn't hiding. He simply waited. The stranger looked directly at Richard before turning and walking away without speaking. Richard hesitated. Part of him wanted to ignore the invitation completely. Another part refused to let the mystery continue. Keeping several yards behind, he followed the man along a quiet sidewalk lined with old oak trees. Neither of them spoke as they passed closed storefronts and darkened homes. The only sounds came from distant traffic and the steady rhythm of their footsteps. Finally, the stranger stopped beside a small public park. "You came?" he said without turning around. "Who are you?" "My name doesn't matter." "It matters to me." "It won't after tonight." Richard folded his arms. "If this is about money, you're wasting your time." The man slowly faced him. "I'm not here for money." "Then why have you been watching my son's wedding?" "Because your family deserves to know the truth before it's too late." Richard frowned. "I don't know what game you're playing." The stranger reached inside his coat. Richard instinctively stepped backward. Instead of a weapon, the man removed a thick brown envelope sealed with clear tape. "Take it." "I'm not interested." "You will be." Richard stared at the envelope, but made no move to accept it. "What is it?" "Evidence." "Evidence of what?" "Of who Sophia really is." Richard's expression hardened. "You leave her alone." "I'm trying to save your son." Richard shook his head. "This is blackmail." "No." "It's lies." "I wish it were." After several seconds of silence, Richard reluctantly accepted the envelope. The stranger spoke one final sentence before walking away into the darkness. "Read everything before sunrise." Within moments, he disappeared between the trees, leaving Richard standing alone beneath the street lamp. Confused and irritated, Richard returned home instead of going back to the reception. He placed the envelope on the kitchen table and stared at it for several minutes. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. Finally, he broke the seal. Several photographs slid onto the table. Most appeared old. Some showed a much younger Sophia with shorter hair and different clothing. Others included unfamiliar people standing beside her outside what looked like a hospital. One photograph seemed to capture her years earlier using another name written beneath the image. Richard immediately assumed the pictures had been manipulated. Anyone could edit photographs. Beneath them rested photocopied documents that resembled medical paperwork. Richard frowned. The pages contained technical language, dates from years earlier, and repeated references to gender-related medical treatment. Another document appeared to identify Sophia under a different legal name before later amendments. His heartbeat quickened. "No!" He pushed the papers away. "This can't be real." The final page contained only one typed paragraph. "Your son has never been told. Ask her yourself if you don't believe me." Richard crumpled the page in frustration. He wanted to throw everything into the fireplace. Instead, he gathered the documents back into the envelope. He refused to accuse someone based on anonymous papers. Yet he also could not ignore them. Unable to sleep, Richard opened his laptop shortly after midnight. He searched public records. Nothing. He searched older newspaper archives. Nothing again. Hours slipped by as he compared dates, names, and scattered details from the documents. Eventually, one record caught his attention. Years earlier, a legal notice documented a court-approved name change matching one of the names shown in the envelope. The notice revealed very little, but enough to suggest the paperwork had not been entirely fabricated. Richard leaned back in his chair. His certainty weakened. By 2 o'clock in the morning, he located another archived record connected to a medical licensing inquiry involving the same hospital listed on the copied documents. It did not identify patients, but the dates aligned closely with those inside the envelope. Coincidence suddenly felt less convincing. Still unwilling to accept the allegations, Richard searched for any explanation that could prove the stranger wrong. Perhaps someone had stolen another person's records. Perhaps Sophia had been helping a relative. Perhaps every document had an innocent explanation. He desperately wanted one. Instead, each new search answered one question while raising two more. Near dawn, Richard spread every page across the dining table. Photographs, court records, medical references, old addresses, handwritten notes. Individually, they proved almost nothing. Together, they painted a story that was becoming increasingly difficult to dismiss. Richard buried his face in his hands. If the material was genuine, Ethan was preparing to marry someone who had concealed a profound part of her past. If it was false, someone had invested years gathering convincing documents simply to destroy two innocent lives. Either possibility was horrifying. As sunlight slowly crept through the windows, Richard realized one detail disturbed him more than anything else. Whoever assembled the envelope had not acted on impulse. The photographs stretched back years. The records had been collected from multiple places. Someone had followed Sophia's life with extraordinary persistence. Someone had waited patiently for the perfect moment. Richard looked once more at the stranger's final message, his confidence replaced by growing uncertainty. For the first time, he stopped asking whether the envelope was meant to ruin the wedding. Instead, he found himself wondering what had happened in Sophia's past, that so many years of secrets had been guarded with such desperate determination. Morning sunlight filled Richard Carter's dining room, but the answers he had searched for through the night remained painfully incomplete. The documents scattered across the table suggested fragments of a life he had never imagined, yet they explained nothing about the person Sophia had become. As his mind wrestled with questions, the story itself reaches backward, away from the wedding and into the years Sophia had spent trying to outrun a past defined by fear rather than freedom. Long before she became Sophia Bennett, she had grown up in a small rural community where differences rarely remained private. Childhood should have been a time of discovery, laughter, and belonging, but for her it became a lesson in silence. Home never felt safe, and school offered little comfort. Every attempt to express individuality invited ridicule from classmates and punishment from the adults, who believed conformity mattered more than compassion. The walls of the modest family house seemed to close in a little more each year. Arguments echoed almost every evening. Doors slammed. Voices rose. Then came the long, suffocating quiet that always followed. Sophia learned at an early age that surviving often meant saying as little as possible. Her father ruled the household through intimidation rather than affection. Every conversation carried the possibility of humiliation. Every mistake became proof that disappointment had entered the family. Instead of encouragement, she received criticism. Instead of understanding, she encountered anger. Her mother tried to soften the atmosphere whenever she could. "Please," she would whisper after another argument. "Just stay in your room tonight." "I'm trying," came the quiet reply. "I know you are." Those simple exchanges became the closest thing either of them experienced to peace. Outside the house, life offered little relief. Children sensed vulnerability with remarkable speed. Cruel jokes spread through classrooms. Whispers followed in hallways. Even teachers occasionally looked away rather than confront the bullying taking place in front of them. Sophia buried every painful memory beneath determination. Books became companions. Libraries became hiding places. Dreams became survival. She promised herself that one day she would leave everything behind. Years passed before that opportunity finally arrived. The moment she reached adulthood, she packed the few belongings she truly valued into 2 worn suitcases and boarded a bus leaving town before sunrise. She carried almost no money, no certainty about the future, and no guarantee that anyone would ever welcome her elsewhere. Yet leaving still felt like freedom. A distant city offered anonymity. No neighbors recognized her. No one remembered childhood gossip. No familiar faces asked painful questions. For the first time in her life, every introduction carried possibility rather than fear. Building a new life proved far more difficult than she imagined. She worked long hours at temporary jobs. She rented tiny apartments with unreliable heating. Some nights dinner consisted only of instant noodles and coffee. Still, every struggle belonged to a future she had chosen herself instead of one chosen for her. Eventually she met people who judged her by kindness rather than history. One coworker helped her find better employment. Another introduced her to a community where acceptance replaced suspicion. Bit by bit, confidence replaced fear. Legal paperwork followed months of preparation. Old records were updated. Documents gradually reflected the identity she had embraced. The process demanded patience, sacrifice, and emotional resilience, but each completed step felt like reclaiming another piece of herself. When she looked into the mirror, she finally recognized the person staring back. Even then, one fear refused to disappear. What if someone from the past returned? The thought lingered during ordinary moments. While shopping. While walking home after work. While sitting alone in quiet cafes. Every unfamiliar face briefly raised old anxieties, before logic reminded her she now lived hundreds of miles away. Then Ethan entered her life. They met during a volunteer relief program after severe flooding devastated nearby communities. Ethan spent hours unloading supplies without expecting recognition. He smiled easily, listened carefully, and treated strangers with genuine respect. Their first conversation lasted only minutes. Their second lasted nearly 2 hours. "You always volunteer?" Ethan asked. "When I can." "What made you come today?" "I know what it feels like to need help." He nodded thoughtfully. "I guess that's reason enough." There was no judgment in his voice. Only understanding. Over the following months, friendship quietly became love. Sophia found herself laughing more often than she had in years. She trusted Ethan with everyday worries. She shared dreams about travel, careers, and family. Yet one chapter of her life remained locked away. Not because she wished to deceive him. Because she feared losing him. Many evenings she rehearsed difficult conversations alone. "I need to tell you something." "No, that's too sudden. There's part of my past you don't know." She never finished practicing. Every attempt ended with overwhelming panic. She imagined confusion crossing Ethan's face. She imagined disappointment. She imagined walking away before he could reject her. Instead, she convinced herself that tomorrow would be better. Tomorrow became next week. Next week became next month. Months quietly became years. The secret grew heavier with every anniversary they celebrated together. One rainy evening, Ethan noticed her unusually distant expression. "You've been quiet all night." "I'm just tired." "You can tell me anything." She forced a smile. "I know." He reached across the table and gently squeezed her hand. "I'm not going anywhere." His sincerity nearly broke her resolve. For one brief moment, she almost revealed everything. Instead, she leaned forward and embraced him without saying another word. The silence protected her from immediate loss while quietly building the foundation for future heartbreak. Unknown to Sophia, someone else refused to let the past remain buried. Across another city, a man opened an old storage box containing faded photographs, newspaper clippings, copied records, and handwritten notes collected over many years. He studied one recent photograph of Sophia smiling beside Ethan. His expression remained cold. "So," he murmured, "you finally think you've disappeared." He carefully returned every document to its folder before placing it inside a larger envelope. On its cover, one name had been written in careful block letters. Richard Carter. The man closed the box, switched off the light, and quietly prepared to set into motion a plan that would bring every hidden secret crashing toward the wedding day. Richard Carter barely slept after piecing together the fragments of Sophia's past. The image of the mysterious man sealing the envelope lingered in his imagination, but even more disturbing was the growing conviction that the documents were not random fabrications. Somewhere between midnight and sunrise, uncertainty had slowly transformed into suspicion. By the following afternoon, suspicion had begun hardening into something far more dangerous. He wanted to speak with Ethan immediately. Several times he picked up his phone. Each time he lowered it again. What could he possibly say? Your fiancé has hidden a life you know nothing about? Someone gave me documents that might destroy your wedding? Every version sounded unbelievable. If the papers proved false, he would permanently damage his son's relationship. If they proved true, he feared Ethan would accuse him of trying to sabotage the marriage. Silence seemed safer. At least for the moment. Richard convinced himself that he needed absolute proof before saying a single word. That decision marked the beginning of an obsession. He returned to his laptop with fresh determination, searching deeper than he had the previous night. Public archives led him toward court databases. Court databases led him toward newspaper records. Newspaper records pointed him toward old addresses, forgotten employers, and legal notices dating back nearly a decade. Each discovery answered one question while creating 3 new ones. Several names appeared repeatedly. 1 hospital, 1 attorney, 1 social worker, 1 county courthouse. Richard printed everything he found. The stack of papers on his desk grew thicker by the hour. His dining room slowly transformed into something resembling an investigator's office rather than a family home. Maps covered one wall. Dates filled handwritten notebooks. Photographs lay arranged in careful chronological order. He circled connections using a red marker. Lines stretched from one document to another. He repeatedly whispered the same sentence. There has to be more. Hours blended together. Coffee replaced meals. The television remained silent. Phone calls from friends went unanswered. Richard no longer noticed the passage of time. His entire world narrowed to one impossible question. Who had Sophia Bennett really been? Late that evening he located another archived legal filing. Although heavily redacted, it confirmed that a person bearing Sophia's former legal name had petitioned for official identity changes years earlier. The filing revealed almost nothing else. Still, to Richard, it felt like confirmation. His breathing slowed. So it wasn't forged. He leaned back in his chair. Until then, part of him had desperately hoped every document inside the envelope had been fabricated. Now that hope weakened. The stranger had not lied about everything. That realization poisoned every remaining doubt. Richard began interpreting every memory through a completely different lens. He remembered Sophia avoiding conversations about childhood. He remembered family photographs never appearing inside their apartment. He remembered holidays spent without relatives. Even ordinary moments suddenly seemed suspicious. Why had Ethan never questioned any of it? Why had nobody else noticed? Or had everyone known except him? That final thought settled heavily inside his chest. Humiliation quietly joined confusion. What if they've all been laughing at us? The question emerged before he could stop it. He hated himself for thinking it. Yet once spoken aloud, it refused to disappear. He imagined wedding guests whispering behind closed doors. He imagined distant relatives discovering the truth after the ceremony. He imagined headlines, television interviews, neighbors discussing the Carter family. Every imagined scenario ended the same way. His son became the object of public ridicule. Richard's protective instincts merged with wounded pride. The combination proved dangerous. Meanwhile, Ethan remained completely unaware of the emotional storm consuming his father. Wedding preparations continued almost non-stop. Florists requested final confirmations. Photographers reviewed schedules. Family members coordinated seating arrangements. Everywhere Ethan looked, people smiled. Only Richard seemed different. During a rehearsal meeting inside the chapel, Ethan noticed his father staring blankly toward the stained glass windows. "Dad?" Richard blinked. "What?" "You've been standing there for 5 minutes." "I was thinking. You've been doing that a lot." Richard forced a weak smile. "Wedding nerves?" Ethan laughed. "I thought only the groom was supposed to have those. I suppose fathers get them too." "You'll relax after tomorrow." Richard nodded. "I hope so." The conversation ended there. Ethan accepted the explanation without another question. He believed his father simply struggled with the emotions of watching his only son begin married life. The truth never crossed his mind. Sophia noticed Richard's distant behavior as well. Whenever they crossed paths, he remained polite, respectful, calm. Yet something had undeniably changed. His smiles ended too quickly. His conversations became unusually brief. His eyes lingered on her longer than before. Not with affection, with uncertainty. One afternoon she quietly asked Ethan, "Is your father upset with me?" Ethan looked surprised. "Why would he be?" "I don't know. He's just stressed." "You think that's all?" "He worries about everything." Sophia smiled faintly. "I guess that makes sense." Still, unease settled inside her. She sensed judgment without understanding its source. That evening Richard left home shortly before sunset. Instead of driving toward the rehearsal venue, he headed in the opposite direction. His destination was an old farmhouse inherited after his own father's death many years earlier. The property had remained empty ever since. Dust covered nearly every surface. Furniture sat beneath white sheets. Memories filled every room. Richard walked directly toward a locked storage cabinet inside the basement. For several moments, he simply stared at it. His father had always believed firearms represented responsibility rather than power. Richard remembered countless lessons from childhood. A gun solves nothing unless there's absolutely no other choice. Those words echoed through his mind. He unlocked the cabinet. Inside rested several carefully stored belongings. Old hunting equipment. Family documents. A wooden case. His hands trembled as he opened it. Wrapped inside faded cloth lay an aging revolver. He had not touched it in years. Carefully lifting the weapon, Richard checked the cylinder. Empty. A separate box still contained ammunition. He stared at both objects for a very long time. His conscience urged him to close the case. Drive home. Speak to Ethan. Call the police. Do anything except continue down this path. Instead, another voice whispered that no one else understood the danger facing his family. If Ethan refused to listen, everything would be too late. Richard slowly loaded the revolver. Each metallic click echoed through the silent basement. When the cylinder finally closed, he placed the weapon back inside its case. He did not yet know what he intended to do. At least, that was what he kept telling himself. Driving home beneath the darkening sky, Richard repeated the stranger's words again and again. Your family deserves to know the truth before it's too late. Those words no longer sounded like manipulation. They sounded like responsibility. By the time he reached his driveway, he had convinced himself that everyone else had failed. The stranger had exposed the truth. Sophia had hidden it. Ethan remained blind. Only Richard could stop the deception before the wedding vows made everything irreversible. And with that belief taking complete control of his thoughts, he unknowingly crossed the final emotional boundary separating suspicion from catastrophe, carrying both the burden of his convictions and the loaded handgun toward the ceremony that would soon descend into unimaginable horror. The morning arrived with clear skies and gentle sunlight pouring through the stained glass windows of the old chapel. Outside, White roses lined the stone walkway, their fragrance carried by a cool breeze that seemed to promise nothing but happiness. Guests gathered early, chatting excitedly while photographers captured smiling families embracing beneath elegant floral arches. Every detail reflected months of careful planning. Inside, Ethan Carter stood near the altar, taking slow breaths as he waited for the ceremony to begin. Daniel adjusted his tie one final time. "You ready?" Ethan smiled nervously. "As ready as I'll ever be. You've been talking about this day for 2 years." "I know." Daniel laughed. "And in 5 minutes, you'll finally stop checking your watch." Ethan looked toward the entrance. "I can't wait to see her." Across the hallway, Sophia Bennett stood before a mirror while her maid of honor carefully straightened the veil resting over her shoulders. "You look beautiful," her friend whispered. Sophia managed to smile. "I hope he still thinks that after today." "What kind of question is that?" "I don't know." "You've been nervous since yesterday." "It's probably just wedding jitters." Her friend gently squeezed her hand. "Everything is going to be perfect." Sophia nodded. She wanted to believe those words. Yet the uneasy feeling that had haunted her for days refused to disappear. At the opposite end of the chapel, Richard Carter entered quietly and took his seat in the front row. His expression remained unreadable. Inside his jacket rested the revolver he had retrieved the previous evening. He had repeated countless times that he only carried it because he feared something unpredictable might happen. Deep inside, however, anger had already begun replacing reason. He watched every movement Sophia made. Every smile. Every glance. Every whispered conversation. To everyone else, she appeared to be a joyful bride. To Richard, she represented years of deception hidden behind a carefully constructed identity. The organ music slowly filled the chapel. Guests rose together. The large wooden doors opened. Sophia appeared at the entrance. Soft sunlight surrounded her as she stepped onto the aisle. A collective gasp spread across the room. She looked radiant. Ethan's eyes filled with tears almost instantly. Their gazes met. For a brief moment, the rest of the world disappeared. The ceremony began with welcoming words from the officiant. He spoke about commitment, trust, forgiveness, the beauty of beginning a shared future. Family members smiled while listening. Parents wiped away emotional tears. Children shifted impatiently in the pews. Everything unfolded exactly as planned. Until Richard noticed something outside. Through one of the chapel windows, he caught sight of the same mysterious stranger standing beneath an oak tree across the street. The man did nothing. He simply watched. When Richard looked directly toward him, the stranger slowly nodded once before disappearing behind a parked vehicle. Richard's pulse quickened. His breathing became uneven. The stranger's presence felt like confirmation that everything inside the envelope had been true. The officiant invited Ethan and Sophia to face one another. They reached for each other's hands. "Ethan," the officiant began, "do you stop?" The single word echoed across the silent chapel. Confused faces turned toward the front row. Richard slowly stood. His voice shook. "This wedding cannot continue." Ethan stared in disbelief. "Dad?" The officiant lowered his notes. "Sir, please sit down." Richard ignored him. Before these vows are spoken, everyone deserves to know the truth. Guests exchanged bewildered looks. Someone whispered, "What's happening?" Sophia's face instantly lost its color. She knew. Without hearing another sentence, she knew exactly what this was about. Ethan stepped toward his father. "Dad, not now." Richard's voice grew louder. "She hasn't told you who she really is." The room fell completely silent. Sophia closed her eyes. Richard reached into his jacket and removed the thick envelope. He held several papers high enough for nearby guests to see. "I have proof." Ethan looked from the documents to his father. "What are you talking about?" Richard's hands trembled. Ask her. Dad. Ask her what her name used to be. Murmurs spread rapidly throughout the chapel. Sophia remained motionless. Tears slowly filled her eyes. Ethan turned toward her. Sophia. She struggled to answer. Her lips parted. Nothing came out. Richard spoke again. Tell him. Several guests quietly stood, unsure whether to leave or remain seated. The officiant attempted to intervene. This isn't the time or place. Richard barely acknowledged him. She built her life on a lie. Ethan stepped closer to Sophia. Please. His voice cracked. I don't understand. Sophia finally looked into his eyes. Everything she had feared for years had arrived. Not privately. Not gently. But before everyone she loved. I'm sorry, she whispered. Ethan stared at her. Sorry for what? She swallowed painfully. There are things about my past. Richard interrupted. Tell him everything. She slowly nodded. I wanted to. When? Richard demanded. When everyone found out. Sophia shook her head. No. When then? Her tears finally escaped. After the honeymoon. The confession hung over the chapel with crushing weight. No one moved. No one spoke. Ethan looked as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. You were going to tell me? Yes. After we were married? I was terrified. His breathing became shallow. You didn't trust me. I loved you. Then why hide it? Because I thought I'd lose you. Richard's anger erupted. You stole his choice. Several relatives pleaded with him. Richard, please. Calm down. This isn't helping. But he no longer seemed capable of hearing them. Years of fear, humiliation, suspicion, and obsessive thinking overwhelmed every remaining piece of restraint. He believed his family had been publicly betrayed. He believed he alone had prevented an even greater deception. Those beliefs completely consumed him. Ethan reached toward his father. Dad, let's leave. Richard stepped backward. No. Please. It ends today. Then, with trembling hands, Richard reached inside his jacket once more. Several guests gasped as the revolver appeared. The room exploded into terrified shouting. Gun! Call the police! Get down! Ethan immediately stepped forward. Dad! Richard's eyes remained fixed on Sophia. She stood frozen. Not from defiance. From shock. I never wanted this, she whispered. Richard raised the weapon. Ethan lunged desperately. Dad, don't. The deafening sound of a gunshot shattered the chapel. Screams instantly filled the sanctuary. Guests threw themselves beneath pews. Others rushed toward the exits in blind panic. Flowers crashed onto the floor. Children cried. The officiant shouted for everyone to remain calm, but his voice disappeared beneath overwhelming chaos. Sophia collapsed onto the aisle. Ethan dropped beside her, calling her name repeatedly as tears streamed down his face. Nearby relatives stood frozen in disbelief, unable to process what had just happened. Richard remained motionless, staring at the scene before him as though reality had suddenly become unrecognizable. The revolver slipped from his hand and struck the marble floor. Its sharp metallic sound echoed through the devastated chapel. Outside, frightened guests poured into the churchyard, while others dialed emergency services with shaking hands. Within minutes, the distant sound of approaching sirens pierced the morning air. Police officers, firefighters, and paramedics raced toward the church, pushing through panicked crowds as they attempted to secure the scene and reach the injured. The wedding that had begun with promises of love had become an active homicide investigation before hundreds of horrified witnesses. As first responders established a perimeter around the chapel, detectives were already being notified that one of the most shocking public shootings the town had ever witnessed was about to become the center of an investigation that would expose far more than a single act of violence. "Just step back." Ethan obeyed reluctantly. His eyes never left Sophia. Every passing second felt unreal. Across the church grounds, officers established yellow crime scene tape around the property. Curious neighbors gathered behind the barriers, while local reporters began arriving after hearing radio dispatches describing an active shooting at a wedding ceremony. Less than 30 minutes later, Detective Rachel Bennett stepped beneath the tape and quietly surveyed the devastation before speaking to anyone. She had investigated homicides for nearly 15 years. She had witnessed domestic killings, organized crime, robberies, and carefully planned murders. Yet the sight before her felt unusually disturbing. Half-finished wedding decorations surrounded pools of scattered flower petals. An abandoned bouquet rested beside an overturned pew. Wedding music still played faintly through the chapel speakers until an officer finally switched the system off. Rachel removed a small notebook from her coat. "What do we know?" A uniformed sergeant answered. "One victim." "The suspect?" "In custody." "Witnesses?" "Hundreds." Rachel sighed softly. Hundreds of witnesses usually means hundreds of different stories. The sergeant nodded. "That's exactly what we've got." She entered the chapel slowly. Crime scene photographers documented every inch of the sanctuary, while forensic technicians marked evidence with numbered placards. The revolver remained exactly where officers had secured it. Shell casing. Blood evidence. Footwear impressions. Every detail received careful attention. Rachel stopped near the altar. She closed her eyes briefly, imagining how the ceremony must have unfolded only minutes before everything collapsed. The contrast between celebration and violence felt overwhelming. Turning toward the lead forensic examiner, she asked, "Any indication of multiple shooters?" "No." "Signs of struggle?" "Some movement after the shot, but nothing beforehand." "So he drew the weapon openly." "Appears that way." Rachel wrote several notes before leaving the chapel to begin witness interviews. The first guest she questioned could barely speak through tears. It happened so fast. "What did you see?" The father started yelling. "What exactly did he say?" I don't remember every word." "Take your time." "He kept saying she'd lied." "About what?" "I don't know." Another witness described events differently. "He wasn't shouting at first." "No." "He sounded heartbroken." "Heartbroken." Like someone begging for the truth. Rachel noted the difference. Minutes later, another guest offered an entirely different version. "He came there looking for trouble." "What makes you say that?" "He never smiled all morning." "Anything else?" "He kept watching the bride." Every interview added another layer of confusion. Some believed Richard acted suddenly. Others insisted he appeared emotionally unstable for days. Several guests remembered seeing him speaking politely with Sophia before the ceremony. Others claimed they never saw them interact at all. Even the sequence of events differed depending on who described them. Human memory, Rachel knew, often fractured during traumatic experiences. Emotion filled gaps with assumption. Fear rearranged timelines. No single witness could reconstruct the entire truth alone. She would need evidence. Fortunately, modern weddings rarely lacked cameras. Officers quickly collected professional video recordings from the wedding photographers. Guests voluntarily surrendered dozens of mobile phone videos. Security cameras mounted outside the chapel provided additional footage showing arrivals, departures, and movements around the building before the ceremony. Rachel and her investigative team established a temporary command center inside a nearby parish office. Several computer monitors displayed synchronized recordings from different angles. "Start 30 minutes before the ceremony," Rachel instructed. The footage rolled. Guests greeted one another. Children played outside. Florists adjusted decorations. Nothing unusual appeared. Then Richard entered. Rachel watched closely. He walked calmly. He greeted relatives politely. He even smiled at several neighbors. Nothing suggested immediate violence. Advance 5 minutes. The recordings continued. Sophia arrived. Applause. Music. Everything appeared perfectly ordinary. Until another camera captured something unexpected. Pause. Rachel leaned toward the screen. Zoom in. The technician enlarged the image. Standing across the street near a row of parked vehicles was an unfamiliar man wearing a dark coat. He remained motionless throughout several minutes of recording. Who's that? No idea. Check every camera. They located him again. Different angle. Same location. Watching. Always watching. Another recording captured Richard briefly looking toward the stranger before entering the chapel. Rachel frowned. Did anyone interview him? The technician shook his head. We don't even know who he is. Find out. The unknown observer immediately became a priority. Inside the chapel recordings, investigators synchronized multiple guest phone videos with the professional wedding footage. The combined recordings revealed subtle details impossible to notice from a single angle. Richard repeatedly looked toward Sophia. Sophia repeatedly glanced toward the entrance. Ethan remained completely unaware. The confrontation unfolded gradually. Every word, every movement, every desperate attempt by Ethan to calm his father. Rachel replayed one moment repeatedly. Sophia's confession. I wanted to tell you after the honeymoon. Silence followed. Then Richard's expression changed. Something inside him seemed to break. Rachel quietly paused the recording. It wasn't only the confession. A detective beside her looked puzzled. What do you mean? He believed something long before he walked into that church. You think he planned it? I think something happened before today. Late that afternoon, Rachel met Ethan inside a private interview room at the police station. His eyes remained swollen from hours of crying. She placed a recorder on the table. I know this is difficult. Ethan nodded weakly. I'll help. Did your father ever threaten Sophia? Never. Did he dislike her? No. Any recent arguments? Nothing serious. Rachel studied him carefully. When did his behavior change? Ethan hesitated. Maybe 3 or 4 days ago. How? He became distant. Angry? No. Afraid. Rachel looked up. Afraid? He kept staring at Sophia. Did he explain why? He said wedding stress. You believed him? I had no reason not to. She opened another folder. Did he ever mention receiving documents? Ethan frowned. What documents? Rachel watched genuine confusion spread across his face. You've never seen an envelope? No. He never showed you anything? Nothing. Rachel slowly closed the folder. Either Richard had hidden everything from his son, or Ethan truly knew nothing. Both possibilities carried enormous consequences. As the interview ended, Ethan stopped before reaching the door. My father isn't a murderer. Rachel remained silent. He made a terrible mistake. She answered carefully. Sometimes terrible mistakes begin long before the trigger is pulled. That evening, investigators returned once more to the security footage showing the unidentified man outside the chapel. Rachel watched him disappear behind parked vehicles just moments before the confrontation began. Whoever he was, he had never entered the wedding. He had simply watched, then vanished. Rachel leaned back in her chair. Find him? One detective asked quietly. You think he caused this? She looked once more at the frozen image on the monitor. I think Richard didn't arrive at that church carrying only a gun. She paused. I think someone spent a very long time loading his mind first. The room fell silent as investigators realized the shooting might not have begun inside the chapel at all, but weeks, months, or even years earlier with an unseen manipulator whose carefully planted deception was only now beginning to emerge. The image of the unidentified man remained frozen on every monitor inside the temporary investigation center long after midnight. Detectives had replayed the chapel security footage dozens of times, hoping to recognize a face or discover a clue that witnesses had overlooked. Richard Carter remained in custody. Ethan struggled to process the collapse of his entire world, and Sophia's fate weighed heavily over everyone connected to the case. Yet Detective Rachel Bennett believed the silent observer outside the church might hold the key to understanding how a wedding became a murder scene. She studied the enlarged photograph once more. Average height. Dark overcoat. Short gray hair. No visible attempt to conceal his face. He wanted to be seen, Rachel murmured. One of the digital analysts looked up. You think so? If he planned to disappear forever, he would have covered his face. So why stand in full view? Rachel considered the question carefully. Because someone inside the chapel was supposed to recognize him. The investigation shifted immediately. Traffic cameras surrounding the church were reviewed. Gas station surveillance from nearby streets was collected. Parking records identified several unfamiliar vehicles entering town during the previous 48 hours. By early afternoon, one camera captured the stranger stopping at a roadside cafe several hours before the wedding. A clear image finally revealed his face. Within another hour, facial recognition linked him to an old driver's license. His name was Victor Hale. Rachel quietly repeated the name. Let's find out who you are. The first background report seemed ordinary. Victor had once worked as a medical records administrator at a regional hospital. He later resigned under unclear circumstances. Financial records showed years of unstable employment. Several addresses. Few lasting relationships. No significant criminal convictions. Nothing immediately connected him to murder. Then another detective entered carrying a thin folder. I found something. Rachel accepted it. What is it? An old civil complaint. She opened the file. Years earlier, Victor had unsuccessfully sued a medical facility following his dismissal. Several pages referenced unauthorized access to confidential patient information. Rachel's eyes narrowed. He worked around medical records. The detective nodded. And look at the dates. Many matched the years appearing throughout the envelope Richard had received. Rachel immediately requested every archived employment record connected to Victor. By evening, another pattern emerged. During his final months at the hospital, Sophia had also received treatment there while legally completing important personal documentation. Although privacy laws protected patient information, Victor's employment would have given him opportunities to see confidential files he was never authorized to keep. Rachel leaned back slowly. So that's where the documents came from. Another investigator added, not all of them. What do you mean? We found property records. He spread several copies across the table. Victor had rented apartments within only a few blocks of Sophia on 3 separate occasions over 6 years. Rachel looked from one address to another. Coincidence? I don't think so. Telephone records provided another disturbing detail. Victor repeatedly purchased prepaid mobile phones that became active only near places Sophia had lived or worked. Each device disappeared after several weeks before another replaced it. No calls connected directly to her. No messages. Only movement. Observation. Waiting. Rachel felt a chill. He wasn't communicating. He was watching. The realization transformed the investigation. Detectives interviewed former co-workers from the hospital. One remembered Victor becoming unusually interested whenever Sophia visited administrative offices. Another recalled him asking unnecessary questions about patients whose records never concerned his job. Most people dismissed the behavior at the time. Only now did those memories gain frightening significance. One retired nurse sighed heavily during her interview. He always seemed resentful. Toward Sophia? Toward anyone rebuilding their life? What do you mean? He blamed everyone else for his own failures. Rachel continued taking notes. Did they ever know each other personally? The nurse hesitated. I saw them argue once. What happened? I couldn't hear everything. Did Sophia seem frightened? Very. The nurse looked toward the window. She avoided him afterward. That statement changed everything. Investigators searched older police reports. Eventually they uncovered a forgotten harassment complaint filed nearly 8 years earlier. No charges had been pursued because the suspect had never directly threatened violence. The complaint listed only repeated unwanted appearances, unexplained letters, and persistent surveillance. The suspect's name had been partially redacted. Court authorization revealed the missing text. Victor Hale. Rachel closed the file. So she already tried to stop him. The harassment eventually faded. At least on paper. Reality proved different. Victor had simply become more careful. Search warrants for Victor's apartment uncovered boxes stacked neatly inside a locked storage room. Each container was labeled by year. Inside lay thousands of photographs. Bus tickets. Utility receipts. Printed social media posts. Maps covered with handwritten notes. Copies of public records. Employment advertisements from cities where Sophia had lived. Investigators stood silently while cataloging the evidence. It resembled the archive of someone documenting another person's entire existence. One detective whispered, "He's been following her for years." Rachel nodded slowly. Not because he loved her. Then why? She opened another notebook discovered inside the storage room. Its pages contained increasingly bitter entries. She erased who she was. People like her don't deserve happy endings. One day everyone will know. The writing grew darker over time. More obsessive. More resentful. Rachel carefully turned another page. There she found a checklist. Find the father. Show him the truth. Do not reveal everything. The final instruction had been underlined twice. Rachel frowned. Don't reveal everything? She immediately compared Victor's collection with the documents inside Richard's envelope. Important differences appeared almost immediately. The envelope contained selected medical records, selected court filings, selected photographs. Entire sections explaining Sophia's abusive childhood were missing. Letters from counselors documenting years of trauma had been excluded. Legal findings showing no fraud had been omitted. Records demonstrating that her identity changes had been completed lawfully never appeared. Everything capable of creating understanding had disappeared. Everything capable of provoking outrage remained. Victor had not fabricated the evidence. He had edited reality. By removing context, he transformed truth into a weapon. Rachel quietly summarized her conclusion. He wanted Richard to reach only one conclusion. Another detective nodded. That he'd been deceived. Exactly. And Richard walked straight into it. Interviews with Richard now sounded different when replayed. He repeatedly insisted someone had forced him to confront the truth. He never described discovering information on his own. Instead, he spoke about responsibility, duty, protection. Words Victor had deliberately planted during their meeting. Rachel realized Richard's emotions had not developed naturally. They had been carefully cultivated. Fear, humiliation, urgency. Each feeling reinforced the next until rational judgment slowly collapsed beneath psychological pressure. She sat alone reviewing Victor's notebook late into the evening. One final entry caught her attention. He will do what I never have to. Rachel closed the notebook. Victor had never intended to pull the trigger himself. He intended to persuade someone else. The distinction mattered enormously. Richard remained legally responsible for firing the weapon. Yet the investigation now revealed another layer of moral responsibility hidden beneath the shooting itself. Rachel gathered the files before addressing her investigative team. This wasn't simply a man discovering painful information. She looked around the room. It was a vulnerable father exposed to carefully selected truths, systematic omissions, and months of emotional manipulation. One detective asked quietly, "So what happens now?" Rachel glanced toward the evidence boxes filled with Victor's years of obsession. "Now we prove exactly how much of this tragedy was engineered." As prosecutors prepared homicide charges against Richard, investigators simultaneously assembled a second case centered on Victor Hale's relentless campaign of psychological manipulation, knowing that the courtroom would soon become the place where every hidden motive, every calculated deception, and every devastating consequence would finally be forced into the light. The discovery of Victor Hale's years of calculated manipulation changed the direction of the investigation, but it could not reverse the irreversible. Sophia Bennett was gone, Ethan's future had been shattered, and Richard Carter remained behind the reinforced walls of the county jail awaiting trial. Detectives now understood that the tragedy had been carefully influenced by another man, yet they also knew that no amount of manipulation had physically pulled the trigger. That reality settled over everyone involved like a heavy shadow that refused to lift. Richard sat alone inside a small concrete cell where time seemed to move differently. The first 24 hours had passed in numb silence. The following days became far worse. Without the chaos of flashing lights, police interviews, or courtroom paperwork, he was finally left alone with his memories. Every sound echoed. Every quiet moment replayed the wedding. He saw Ethan smiling at the altar. He heard Sophia whispering that she had planned to tell the truth. He felt the revolver leaving his hand. Then came the gunshot. Again. And again. And again. Sleep became nearly impossible. Whenever exhaustion finally overtook him, nightmares replaced rest. He awoke drenched in sweat after dreaming that the wedding had restarted from the beginning. Each dream offered another opportunity to make a different choice. Each ended exactly the same. The shot always came. The screams always followed. One morning a corrections officer quietly slid breakfast through the slot in his cell door. Richard never touched it. "You need to eat," the officer said. "I'm not hungry." "You haven't eaten much all week." Richard stared at the floor. "I don't deserve to." The officer remained silent for a moment before continuing down the corridor. Later that afternoon, Richard requested writing materials. The jail librarian delivered a small notebook and several sheets of paper. For hours, he struggled to write a single sentence. Eventually, the words appeared. "Ethan," he stopped. Tears blurred his vision. How could any letter begin after what he had done? He crumpled the page and threw it into the corner. A second attempt lasted only 3 lines. A third ended even sooner. No apology felt large enough. Across town, Ethan sat inside the quiet apartment he and Sophia had carefully decorated together over the previous year. Wedding gifts still rested unopened against one wall. The honeymoon tickets remained inside a kitchen drawer. Her favorite sweater still hung beside the front door. Every ordinary object had become another reminder of the life they would never share. Friends visited daily. Most conversations ended after only a few minutes. No one knew what to say. Silence often felt kinder than empty reassurance. Daniel eventually arrived carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one on the table. "You should eat something." "I'm not hungry." "You've said that every day." "I know." Daniel sat across from him. "I'm worried about you." Ethan looked toward the engagement photograph resting on the bookshelf. "I keep thinking she'll walk through the door." Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Ethan asked the question that had haunted him since the shooting. "Did she lie to me?" Daniel answered carefully. "She hid part of her past." Is that the same thing? I don't think it's that simple. Ethan lowered his head. I wish she trusted me. So do I. I would have listened. Daniel nodded. I believe you would have. Those words brought little comfort. Detective Rachel Bennett later visited Ethan to update him on the investigation. She explained Victor Hale's history, the harassment, the stolen records, the years of surveillance, the carefully edited envelope. Ethan listened without interruption. When Rachel finished, he asked quietly, "So my father was manipulated?" He was. But he still chose to shoot her. Rachel met his eyes. Yes. Ethan leaned back slowly. I've spent days trying to blame someone else. There are several people whose choices contributed. But only one fired the gun. Rachel remained silent. My father taught me my whole life that anger solves nothing. His voice trembled. Then he ignored his own lesson. Before leaving, Rachel handed him a sealed envelope recovered from Sophia's apartment. It was addressed to you. Ethan waited until she left before opening it. Inside rested several handwritten pages. The first line immediately shattered him. If you're reading this, it means I waited too long to tell you the truth. He continued reading through tears. Sophia described her childhood. The abuse. The isolation. The years spent rebuilding her life. She admitted fearing rejection every single day they were together. She never excused her silence. Instead, she accepted responsibility for delaying the conversation she desperately wanted to have. One paragraph remained fixed in Ethan's mind. I never doubted your kindness. I doubted whether I deserved it. He folded the letter carefully. For the first time since the wedding, anger gave way to grief. He realized Sophia had not hidden her past because she wanted to deceive him. She had hidden it because years of trauma convinced her that honesty would cost her the only happiness she had ever known. That realization made losing her even more unbearable. 3 days later, Richard finally received permission to make a phone call. He dialed Ethan's number from memory. The phone rang several times. Then someone answered. Ethan? Silence. My son? Another long pause followed. Richard struggled to breathe. I need to tell you how sorry I am. Ethan finally spoke. You don't get to call me that anymore. Richard closed his eyes. I know. You killed the woman I loved. I wasn't thinking. Exactly. His voice grew steadier. You thought you were protecting me. I believed. I don't care what you believed. Richard began crying openly. I would give anything to change it. You can't. I'm still your father. No. The word landed harder than any sentence Richard had ever heard. My father died inside the church. The line went dead. Richard lowered the receiver slowly before prison staff escorted him back toward his cell. He never attempted another phone call. Beyond the families directly involved, the shooting became the subject of relentless national debate. News channels replayed portions of the wedding footage. Commentators argued endlessly about deception, violence, discrimination, personal responsibility, and the consequences of prejudice. Some insisted Richard had been manipulated beyond reason. Others argued manipulation never justified murder. Many expressed compassion for Sophia's lifelong struggle and condemned the hatred that had followed her even after she rebuilt her life. Others focused on the emotional impact of withheld truths inside intimate relationships. Online discussions grew increasingly hostile. Friends stopped speaking. Families argued over dinner tables. Religious leaders delivered opposing sermons. Advocacy organizations organized vigils honoring Sophia while calling for greater understanding of people forced to live in fear. The town itself changed. Flowers continued appearing outside the chapel for weeks. Wedding guests sought counseling together. Several children who had witnessed the shooting began trauma therapy after suffering recurring nightmares. The officiant temporarily stepped away from ministry, unable to conduct another wedding without remembering that terrible morning. Even first responders admitted the scene remained difficult to forget. Detective Rachel Bennett attended one community memorial without identifying herself. She watched strangers comfort one another beneath candlelight. No speeches attempted to simplify what had happened. The tragedy resisted simple explanations. There had been fear, silence, manipulation, poor choices, trauma, hatred, love. Every one of those elements had played a role. Yet none erased the others. Standing quietly at the edge of the gathering, Rachel reflected that justice would never restore what had been lost. The courts could assign legal responsibility, but they could not heal broken families or return stolen futures. As the investigation officially closed and prosecutors finalized their case files, attention shifted toward the courtroom, where 12 jurors would soon face the difficult task of weighing not only Richard Carter's fatal decision, but also the hidden chain of manipulation and long-buried secrets that had led to one devastating moment of irreversible violence. The weeks of investigation, public debate, and private grief ultimately led to the place where every major decision would finally be judged. Reporters gathered outside the county courthouse before sunrise. Television vans crowded nearby streets, and residents formed long lines hoping to secure one of the limited seats inside the courtroom. What had begun as a joyful wedding had become one of the most closely watched criminal trials the town had ever witnessed, not only because of the shocking violence, but because every revelation seemed to raise new questions about responsibility, truth, and manipulation. Richard Carter entered the courtroom wearing a plain gray suit instead of prison clothing. His wrists remained uncuffed until moments before the jury arrived. He appeared older than he had only months earlier. His shoulders sagged. His hair had become noticeably grayer. Most striking of all were his eyes. The certainty that had once fueled his actions had completely disappeared. Only exhaustion remained. Across the room, Ethan sat quietly beside Daniel Brooks. He never looked toward his father. Sophia's absence felt almost visible. An empty chair behind the prosecution table held a single-frame photograph of her smiling during a volunteer event where she had first met Ethan. No one spoke about the photograph. Its presence required no explanation. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered precisely at 9 o'clock. The courtroom stood. After preliminary instructions, the prosecution delivered its opening statement. Lead prosecutor Michael Harris approached the jury slowly. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about confusion." He paused. "It is not about rumors." Another brief silence followed. "It is about choice." He walked toward a large display screen. "The evidence will show that Richard Carter investigated for days." Photographs appeared. He gathered documents. Maps followed. He retrieved a firearm from storage. The revolver appeared on screen. He loaded that weapon. Michael looked directly at the jury. He carried it into a church. Another image appeared. And despite countless opportunities to stop, he deliberately fired at an unarmed woman standing beside his son. He allowed those words to settle. "The defense may discuss manipulation." He nodded slightly. "You will hear disturbing evidence about deception committed by another individual." His voice remained steady. "But manipulation explains motive." He pointed toward Richard. "It does not erase personal responsibility." The prosecutor returned to his table. Defense attorney Laura Simmons rose immediately afterward. She stood silently for several moments before speaking. "This courtroom will hear about a terrible decision." She glanced briefly toward Richard. "No one disputes that." She then faced the jury. "But justice requires understanding how human judgment can be broken." Laura displayed several photographs recovered from Victor Hale's apartment. Boxes, files, surveillance notes, years of documentation. This was not a random discovery. She held up a notebook. It was a carefully engineered psychological campaign. She described Victor's harassment, the stolen records, the selective omission of crucial facts, the months spent tracking Sophia. Then she spoke quietly. Richard Carter did not awaken one morning wanting to kill anyone. She looked toward the jury. He became the final target of a man who understood exactly how fear, shame, and manipulation could overwhelm reason. The opening statements ended. Witness testimony began immediately. Detective Rachel Bennett became the prosecution's first witness. She calmly described the crime scene, evidence collection, forensic procedures, body camera recordings, security footage. The prosecutor asked, "Did the defendant voluntarily bring a loaded firearm into the chapel?" "Yes." "Did anyone force him to draw that weapon?" "No." "Did anyone physically prevent him from leaving before the shooting?" "No." Cross-examination followed. Laura approached the witness stand. "Detective Bennett, did your investigation identify another individual connected to this case?" "Yes." "Victor Hale." "Correct." "Did he spend years collecting private information about Sophia Bennett?" "Yes." "Did he intentionally deliver selected documents to Richard Carter?" "He did." "Did those documents exclude important information that provided context?" "Yes." Laura nodded. "So Richard Carter received truth?" Rachel answered carefully. "Only part of it." "And partial truth can become deception?" "It can." The jury listened closely. Next came digital forensic analysts. Large monitors displayed synchronized security footage from inside and outside the chapel. Jurors watched Richard entering calmly. They watched the mysterious stranger standing across the street. They watched Sophia repeatedly glance toward the entrance. The courtroom remained silent as the confrontation unfolded. Then the gunshot echoed through the speakers. Several jurors instinctively flinched. The recording ended. No one spoke for several seconds. The prosecution next introduced evidence recovered from Victor Hale's apartment. Investigators described boxes containing years of surveillance material. One detective read aloud entries from Victor's notebook. "Find the father. Do not reveal everything. He will do what I never have to." The prosecutor asked, "What did those entries suggest?" "That Victor intended someone else to act." "Specifically Richard Carter?" "Yes." Cross-examination emphasized another point. Laura asked, "Did Victor ever threaten Richard directly?" "No." "Did he order him to shoot anyone?" "No." "So psychological influence, not physical coercion?" "Correct." Medical experts then testified about trauma and decision-making. One psychologist explained how prolonged emotional manipulation could distort perception. Individuals under sustained psychological pressure may gradually lose the ability to evaluate information objectively. The prosecutor stood. "Doctor, does that eliminate free will?" "No." "Can manipulated people still distinguish right from wrong?" "In many situations, yes." "So manipulation is not the same as compulsion." "Correct." Another expert discussed Sophia's psychological history. The courtroom learned about years of abuse, repeated rejection, counseling, recovery, legal identity documentation. None of those records suggested criminal behavior. Instead, they revealed someone rebuilding a life through lawful means. Several jurors quietly wiped away tears. Then came Ethan. The courtroom grew still as he approached the witness stand. He took the oath, sat down, folded his shaking hands together. The prosecutor spoke gently. "Did you love Sophia Bennett?" "Yes." "Did she ever tell you about her past?" "No." "Would you have listened if she had?" Ethan swallowed. "Yes." "Did your father ever discuss receiving documents before the wedding?" "Never." "What changed after the shooting?" "My entire life." His voice broke. "I lost both of them. The prosecutor paused before asking one final question. How so? The woman I loved died. He looked briefly toward Richard. And the father who raised me disappeared the moment he pulled that trigger. Silence filled the courtroom. During cross-examination, Laura remained respectful. Mr. Carter, do you believe your father loved you? Yes. Do you believe he was protecting you? Ethan closed his eyes. I think he convinced himself that he was. Do you believe Victor Hale manipulated him? Yes. Laura nodded. No further questions. Richard himself eventually chose to testify. Against his attorney's recommendation. He slowly entered the witness box. The prosecutor asked the first question. Why did you take the gun? Richard answered quietly. Because I believed my son was being destroyed. Were you angry? Yes. Humiliated? Yes. Did you know carrying a loaded firearm into a wedding was illegal? Yes. Did you know shooting someone would likely kill them? Richard lowered his head. Yes. The prosecutor allowed several seconds of silence. So you understood exactly what you were doing? Richard's voice barely emerged. I understood the gun. He looked toward the jury. I didn't understand what had happened to my mind. Defense questioning focused on the weeks before the wedding. Richard described sleepless nights. The envelope. The stranger. Hours of obsessive research. The growing belief that everyone had deceived him. I stopped trusting my own judgment. He wiped away tears. I trusted his. You mean Victor Hale? Yes. He gave me enough truth to destroy my ability to see the rest. When testimony concluded, both attorneys presented their closing arguments. The prosecution reminded jurors that manipulation never forced Richard to retrieve the revolver, load it, carry it into the church, or pull the trigger. The defense urged them to consider the extraordinary psychological campaign that had deliberately targeted a father's deepest fears until rational thinking collapsed beneath carefully manufactured panic. Judge Whitmore finally addressed the jury. You are not asked to decide whether this tragedy was complicated. She paused. It clearly was. She looked across the courtroom. You are asked to determine legal responsibility while considering every piece of credible evidence presented before you. The 12 jurors rose quietly before following the bailiff into the deliberation room, leaving behind a courtroom suspended between grief and judgment as every person present waited for a verdict that would forever define the final chapter of an already devastating story. The jury returned shortly after noon on the third day of deliberations. Every seat inside the courtroom was occupied, while dozens more watched from an overflow room where the proceedings were broadcast live. Reporters stood ready with notebooks, cameras, and microphones, knowing that the verdict would become the final legal chapter of a tragedy that had captivated the nation. Yet inside the courtroom, no one appeared interested in headlines anymore. They wanted only an ending, even if no ending could ever feel complete. Richard Carter stood slowly as the clerk addressed the jury. Have you reached a verdict? The foreperson nodded. We have. The courtroom fell completely silent. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant. A brief pause seemed to stretch endlessly. Guilty. Richard closed his eyes. He neither cried nor protested. He simply lowered his head. Several jurors looked away, unable to meet his gaze. They had listened to weeks of testimony describing manipulation, deception, trauma, and heartbreak, yet they had ultimately reached the same conclusion. Victor Hale had carefully influenced Richard's thinking, but Richard alone had made the final decision to raise the revolver and pull the trigger. Several days later, the court reconvened for sentencing. Judge Eleanor Whitmore spoke deliberately, choosing every word with care. This case has revealed extraordinary psychological manipulation carried out by another individual. She paused. That manipulation deserves condemnation. The courtroom remained silent. However, the law also recognizes that each person remains responsible for choices they knowingly make. She looked directly at Richard. You carried a loaded firearm into a place of peace. Another pause followed. You ended an innocent life before hundreds of witnesses. The judge imposed a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Richard accepted the decision without argument. Before deputies escorted him away, he turned toward Ethan one final time. I loved you every day of your life. Ethan remained seated. Tears filled his eyes, but he did not answer. The courtroom doors closed behind Richard. Father and son never saw each other again. Authorities later charged Victor Hale with numerous crimes connected to unlawful surveillance, harassment, identity-related offenses, evidence tampering, and conspiracy arising from his deliberate campaign of psychological manipulation. Although he never fired the fatal shot, the court concluded that his years of calculated obsession had directly contributed to the chain of events leading to the murder. He was convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to a lengthy prison term, where he would spend decades confronting the consequences of his own choices. Months passed. The media slowly moved on to newer stories. Television cameras disappeared from outside the courthouse. Flowers stopped arriving at the chapel. The town gradually returned to ordinary routines. Only the people whose lives had been shattered understood that ordinary life would never truly return. On a quiet autumn afternoon, Ethan visited the cemetery carrying a small bouquet of white roses. Sophia's headstone overlooked a peaceful hillside where gentle wind stirred the surrounding trees. He knelt carefully before placing the flowers against the polished stone. For several minutes he said nothing. Silence felt appropriate. Eventually he unfolded the letter Sophia had written before the wedding. Its edges had become worn from being read so many times. He smiled sadly as he reached the final paragraph once again. I wish we'd had one honest conversation, he whispered. A tear slipped down his face. I would have stayed. He carefully folded the letter. I hope you finally know that. The breeze carried fallen leaves across the grass as Ethan stood to leave. Before walking away, he rested his hand gently on the headstone one last time. Goodbye, Sophia. He never returned. Detective Rachel Bennett officially closed the investigation several weeks later. The final case file occupied several thick binders filled with forensic reports, witness interviews, surveillance records, courtroom exhibits, and psychological assessments. She placed the last signed document into the archive box before closing the lid. Another detective entered her office. Finished? Rachel nodded. Finally. You think justice was done? She considered the question for a long moment. The courts delivered justice. She looked toward the sealed evidence boxes. But justice isn't the same as healing. After her colleague left, Rachel remained alone. She reflected on everything the investigation had uncovered. An abused child had grown into an adult searching for acceptance. A lonely man had transformed resentment into obsession. A protective father had surrendered reason to fear. A loving son had lost both the woman he planned to marry and the father he once admired. None of those tragedies had begun inside the chapel. They had begun years earlier through silence, prejudice, untreated pain, and deliberate manipulation. The gunshot had merely become the final echo of choices made long before the wedding day. Rachel switched off the office lights and quietly walked toward the exit. Outside, evening settled over the city. People hurried home to families, friends, and ordinary lives, unaware of how easily fear could grow when truth remained buried and hatred was allowed to guide human judgment. The Carter case gradually became another archive file resting on a courthouse shelf, but its lessons endured. Secrets left unspoken can deepen wounds. Manipulation can distort even sincere intentions. Trauma ignored rarely disappears on its own. Most importantly, no betrayal, no humiliation, and no painful revelation can ever justify taking another human life. Truth delayed may sometimes lead to heartbreak. Violence, however, can never become justice. And that was the only conclusion every survivor carried forward long after the verdict had been read.